Hi, writer. My name is Kate. I'm going to be giving you feedback today on your draft, Personal Responsibility in Nemesis and Prayer in the Furnace. You had a couple concerns that you put on your appointment report, including you'd like you'd like some feedback on your introduction, your transitions, and your conclusion, as well as some feedback on citation, sentence level errors. My feedback today is going to be focusing primarily on thinking about the organization of your main body paragraphs. I think that's where the bulk of my suggestions for revision are going to come from. But I'll also go through and point out a couple moments where I think you have an opportunity to make some sentence level fixes to help with the clarity of your writing. And also I'll start with a couple suggestions for your introduction that I think can also help apply to your conclusion. Okay, so as we get started here, you said that you felt like your first sentence was lacking a little bit, and I have to agree. I think the phrasing that they share a few themes kind of minimizes why you've brought these two texts together. And I think that's my big recommendation for you, is to tell your reader right off the bat why you are bringing these two texts together, what the purpose or motivation is there. As I went through, full disclosure, I'm not familiar with either of these texts, but as I went through, I was kind of wondering why you were comparing these two texts in the first place. I never really felt like I understood that. I didn't, and that I think is an important element to include in an essay like this, because you're giving your reader a reason to read, and I think that's really important. So I think by identifying that and explaining, what your reader can get out of looking at this kind of comparison or contrast essay, or this analysis of these two texts, they'll want to read more and they'll have a greater sense of buy-in or purpose for reading what you're talking about. They'll understand the significance of the activity. So as you suss that out, I also recommend taking a little bit more time in your introduction to establish the context of the two texts in general. Again, this might be because I'm unfamiliar with the two texts, but I really had a hard time understanding what was going on with the chaplain and Mr. Bucky or Mr. Cantor as I read, because the details seem to be kind of underdeveloped. I'm not saying that you should provide a full summary of the entire text, but maybe just two sentences about each one that really gives us a sense of what those texts are about, what those stories are about, so that it's easier to keep track of them as you explain, as you analyze them. On that note, one of the few sentence level recommendations that I'm going to focus on right now is being more consistent in how you reference the two main characters. The chaplain, you change how you address him from paragraph to paragraph, sentence to sentence. Sometimes he's Mr. Jeffrey, sometimes he's Chaplain, sometimes he's Mr. Chaplain. Most commonly, he's the chaplain. I think, being consistent is going to really help out your reader. Same with Mr. Bucky Cantor. If you're going to refer to him as Mr. Cantor, make sure you're doing that consistently from sentence to sentence, paragraph to paragraph throughout the entire text. As a reader might not be familiar with these, that'll definitely help create some consistency. Another really minimal sentence level thing is also maybe looking into whether or not Marines should be capitalized. I do believe it should be. and that's just because it is a proper noun, it is a title, you are a Marine, and again, I think that'll help signal to your reader significance there. Okay, so now on to the area where I think you have the biggest room for revision within your document here, and that's connected to this idea of transitions that you're asking about. But more importantly, I think you want to focus on the purpose of each of your paragraphs. Right now, the structure that I was gathering was that you're doing a what appears to be kind of a comparison structure. You first talk about the chaplain, and I am assuming that the chaplain is in Prayer in the Furnace. And again, that might be helpful to really connect, in your introduction, connect one character more explicitly to a specific text. Right now, we kind of just assume that you're using parallel structure between these two sentences, but you don't overtly tell us. So Philip Clay's book, The Chaplain, we get that first paragraph that talks about how the chaplain kind of understands right and wrong. And then we switch over to Bucky, or Mr. Cantor. Again, being a little bit more consistent in how you refer to a character is going to be helpful. So you have a transitional sentence here that tells us on the surface what the next paragraph is going to be about, but it's not necessarily very clear to me as a reader why these two paragraphs are together and what's really bringing them together, how Nemesis is commenting on Prayer in the Furnace, or vice versa. And I think that could be a really useful thing to think about, is why you're comparing these two stories, why you're contrasting them, and how you can maybe use transitional sentences to more effectively communicate what are the like themes between each of them. It was a little bit difficult for me to pick out the main point of each paragraph, and I think you might want to check out the Purdue Owl has a good page about reverse outlining, and essentially what that is doing, and I tried to do it a little bit and struggled a bit with your essay, is identifying the main point of each paragraph. So, going through each paragraph, jotting down in the margins like a phrase or so about what the point of that is. And then you can look at it from a distance and figure out, like, okay, overall, the purpose of these two paragraphs is to explain how the main character of either text experiences decision making or something like that. And then explaining why the comparison is important or significant, or why you're doing it. You want to make sure that you're doing that. And then you can break it up into the organization that you're doing right here, where you're talking about one text in one paragraph and one text in another paragraph. But what I'm noticing is that you tend to work on the transition between the two paragraphs, from that you go from the Clay text to the Roth text. But then when you go back to the Clay text, there's no transition. You just kind of break it off. And so again, thinking about how the main points are connecting to one another, not just the two texts, but the main points as a whole. So like if you're going to talk about, point 1, 2, and 3, really give us a good explanation of why those 3 points are being brought together, why they're significant, why you're writing about them in the context of these two pieces. On that note, as a general rule in academic writing, I would discourage ending a paragraph with a quotation, and that is usually just because we want to end with our own words so that our reader knows why we have included a quote. Quotes tend to be used primarily as evidence for a claim that we're making. And so you want to make sure that you're explaining why you're including a piece of evidence and not just expecting the evidence to stand on its own. All right. So that's the feedback that I have for you about your transitions. I think stepping back for a minute and thinking back about what are your, what is the purpose of the paragraphs? If this is your thesis statement, do you feel like you are really examining certainty and uncertainty about right and wrong throughout this essay? And are you clearly addressing this? My sense was that I wasn't very clearly understanding how that worked, and I don't know if that was from a lack of context from the texts themselves, or because I felt like I didn't understand why these two texts were together. But I think that there's focusing on the organization might be a great place to start, and really making sure that your main points are clearly connected to purpose. So that's the feedback that I have for you today. As you go through and revise, I think a lot of I could have spent a little bit of time talking more about some sentence level stuff, but I think that as you go through, a lot of stuff is going to change. As for citations, your in-text citations, if you're using MLA style, looked good to me. There wasn't anything that stood out about that being incorrect. So I hope this feedback was helpful, and you have a good time with your revisions, and I hope you continue to use the Writing Center. Thanks for listening.